Welcome to Arsenal, where the weapons and war machines of military history come to life. Today, we explore the F-15 Eagle in the Air Superiority Role from the Cold War to Desert Storm, and the crews and opponents who gave it its reputation. If you enjoy learning how technology, tactics, and human decisions come together in combat, you can find more articles, podcasts, and resources at trackpads.com. The night sky over the Iraqi border is almost black when the pair of F-15 sea fighters cross the line. Far below, the desert is featureless and invisible, a dark sheet with no landmarks. Up at more than 20,000 feet, the world shrinks to a glowing radar scope, a head-up display floating in the pilot's view, and the steady push of two engines in afterburner. The pilots are on combat air patrol in the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm, listening to the calm voice of an airborne warning and control aircraft, building the picture they cannot see with their own eyes. The air feels crowded and tense. Contacts begin to bloom as faint symbols at long range, sliding across the scope like cautious ghosts. Controllers call out tracks that look like Iraqi fighters, probably MiGs, lifting to challenge the strike packages aimed at airfields and command centers. The lead eagle eases his nose a little left, bringing his wingman into the right angle for an intercept, while keeping the formation tight and disciplined. Arsenal is the Friday feature of Dispatch, U.S. Military History magazine. In this moment, every design decision behind the F-15 comes down to a simple demand: to find, fix, and kill first. When the first missile leaves the rail, it feels like a solid shove more than a roar. The weapon streaks away into the darkness toward a target the pilot has never seen with his own eyes, guided by radar and a carefully managed firing solution. A heartbeat later, his wingman calls his own shot, and another missile flashes out into the night. On the radio, there is a brief, controlled chaos as airborne controllers confirm tracks. Other fighters announce their launches, and the first calm reports of kills begin to come back. Somewhere out in that darkness, Iraqi aircraft are falling in fire. For the Eagle crews, this is exactly what the aircraft was built to do. Their job is to seize control of the sky and hold it so that bombers, attack aircraft, and support platforms can work underneath with far less fear. The contrast with earlier wars is stark. The road from the messy, uncertain skies over Vietnam to this carefully orchestrated first night of Desert Storm runs straight through the hard lessons that shaped the F-15. The scene over the border is the visible tip of a much deeper story. Those lessons began in the 1960s when the United States Air Force went to war over North Vietnam with heavy, missile-armed fighters that were supposed to sweep the skies clean from long range. In theory, radar-guided weapons would destroy enemy aircraft before they ever came close. In practice, many air battles collapsed into close-in turning fights where smaller, more agile MiGs could exploit their nimbleness against larger, more complex opponents. Pilots discovered that assumptions about long-range missile duels did not always match the reality of cloud, terrain, and political constraints. It was a painful education. Strict rules of engagement often required pilots to get visual confirmation before firing, which dragged them into the very short-range fights the new aircraft were not optimized to win. Early missiles could be unreliable, failing to guide or fusing badly at the worst moments. At the same time, the fighters themselves were frequently designed as multi-role machines, expected to haul bombs as well as patrol for enemy aircraft, which meant compromises in weight, visibility, and handling. Crews felt the gap between what their aircraft were supposed to do on paper and what they actually had to do in the thick, confusing airspace over North Vietnam. That gap drove frustration and change. Meanwhile, intelligence imagery from inside the Soviet Union showed a new generation of fighters and interceptors taking shape on distant ramps. The real shock came with a large MiG-25, a fast, high-flying interceptor that seemed at first glance to outrun and outclimb anything in Western service. Even as analysts argued over the true strengths and weaknesses of these aircraft, their appearance underscored a simple point that no one could ignore. Potential enemies were not standing still. Inside the Air Force, a consensus slowly formed that air superiority could not be left to aircraft designed around bombing first and air-to-air combat second. The service needed a dedicated air superiority fighter with no illusions about its primary purpose. It had to outclimb, out-accelerate, and out-turn anything likely to oppose it, carry a powerful radar and long-range missiles, and still be able to fight and survive in a close-in dogfight. The blunt slogan that emerged, "Not a pound for air to ground," captured that mindset. Out of requirements documents and design studies grew the concept of a large twin-engine fighter with the thrust, radar, and weapon load to give its pilots an overwhelming edge in the kind of battles they expected next. That concept would become the F-15 Eagle. Turning that hard-won concept into a real aircraft meant rewriting the way the service thought about fighters. The new design effort pulled together lessons from Vietnam, new ideas about energy and maneuverability, and a sober look at Soviet threats. Engineers were told to chase climb rate, acceleration, and sustained turning performance, even if it meant building a larger and more expensive fighter than some critics liked. The emerging picture was a twin-engine aircraft with high thrust, a powerful radar, and a big wing that could carry both fuel and weapons without becoming clumsy in a dogfight. It would be an air superiority specialist, not a compromise. Several major companies competed to build that specialist, but late in 1969, the United States Air Force chose McDonnell Douglas to carry the Eagle forward. Full-scale development moved quickly, with the first prototype flying in July 1972, and production aircraft reaching combat squadrons in the mid-1970s. By skipping a long experimental phase and committing early, the service accepted risk on cost and complexity in return for getting its new fighter into frontline units before the next crisis arrived. Within a few years, F-15 Eagles sat on ramps at bases in the continental United States, in Europe, and later across the Middle East. They often stood alert with live missiles under their wings. Every major feature carried a clear trade-off. The large wing and twin vertical tails gave the F-15 tremendous lift and control at high angles of attack, but they also created a big visual and radar target. Twin engines delivered huge thrust and a margin of safety over water or hostile terrain. Yet each engine was a complex, maintenance-heavy machine that had to be tamed after early reliability troubles. The radar was built to reach far and pick out low-flying targets against ground clutter, which meant investing heavily in advanced electronics and pilot displays. Designers shaved weight wherever they could to keep the thrust-to-weight ratio high enough for the climb and turn performance the Air Force demanded. It was a constant balancing act. At a glance, the F-15 Eagle is an American twin-engine, all-weather air superiority fighter built by McDonnell Douglas for the United States Air Force during the later Cold War. In its main air-to-air forms, it is a single-seat aircraft flown by one pilot who works closely with ground controllers and airborne warning crews. Its primary armament is a mix of radar-guided and heat-seeking missiles backed by a 6-barrel 20mm cannon buried in the right wing root. The Eagle can sprint to speeds above Mach 2 and reach altitudes around 60,000 feet, letting it dive onto threats or climb above them as needed. More than 1,000 basic air superiority Eagles were produced, many delivered to allies in the Middle East and Asia, so its silhouette became a common sight wherever the United States and its partners needed to control the sky. By the early 1980s, the F-15C version had arrived as the definitive air superiority model, replacing older Eagles on the front line. The basic concept had proven sound in training and in the hands of foreign users. The aircraft could launch from distant bases, climb hard, push forward under the guidance of its radar and supporting controllers, and meet enemy aircraft on favorable terms. That is the strategic view. To understand how it felt to live with the jet day after day, it helps to walk around it at ground level and then climb into the cockpit. Seen from the ramp, the F-15 is a big fighter. Its shoulder-mounted swept wings sit high on the fuselage with broad flaps and ailerons that hint at strong, low-speed handling. Two tall vertical tails rise from the rear, framing the exhausts of the twin engines and giving the aircraft its distinctive outline. Rectangular air intakes sit under the wing roots and angle outward, feeding each engine even when the jet is flying at high angles of attack or high speed. A pointed radome at the nose hides the large radar antenna that is the heart of the Eagle's long-range hunting ability. The landing gear is stout and widely spaced, built to handle heavy takeoffs with full missile loads, fuel tanks, and, on later models, conformal fuel tanks wrapped around the fuselage. Climb the ladder and the feel changes. The pilot sits high under a single-piece bubble canopy with very little framing, which gives wide views forward, down the nose, and over each shoulder. Directly ahead is the head-up display that projects key flight and targeting information into the pilot's line of sight so eyes can stay outside the cockpit in a fight. Below that sits a mix of traditional round dials and more modern display panels that report on engines, radar, navigation, and weapons. The stick and throttle are exactly where a fighter pilot expects them, but a great deal of design work went into arranging switches and controls so that essential functions can be reached without taking hands off those primary controls. It is a compact workspace, but clearly purpose-built. Behind the panels, the avionics tie the jet's senses together. The Eagle's pulse Doppler radar can look up to track high-altitude threats or look down and separate moving aircraft from ground clutter, which is critical for defending low-flying bombers and strike packages. A central computer fuses radar returns, navigation data, and weapons status into clear symbols so the pilot can sort contacts, prioritize threats, and launch missiles without drowning in raw numbers. An internal electronic warfare system listens for hostile radars and can cue chaff and flare dispensers or external jamming pods when needed. For the pilot, the result is a cockpit that feels busy but purposeful, built so that long missions of scanning, sorting, and sometimes fighting stay manageable. One person can handle a lot. Deeper in the fuselage, the pair of Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines give the Eagle its defining physical sensation, relentless thrust. At military power, they haul the aircraft through thick air with authority, and in afterburner, they push it rapidly uphill, trading fuel for altitude and speed in a way pilots never forget. Early in the Eagle's career, those engines were temperamental, and maintainers spent long hours dealing with the issues that came from running them hard and fast in real service. Over time, improved versions and better procedures tamed many of the worst problems, letting units fly more sorties with fewer engine-related surprises. Pilots learned to trust that when they lit the burners and pulled hard, the jet would keep responding. That trust mattered. Weapons fit naturally into this environment. Under the wings and along the belly, the F-15 carries its mix of radar-guided and infrared-guided missiles on pylons placed to minimize drag and interference with airflow. In a typical air superiority load, medium-range radar missiles ride on the fuselage stations, while heat-seeking missiles sit at the wingtips or on outer pylons ready for close-in work. The internal cannon and its ammunition drum are hidden in the right wing root behind access panels, giving the pilot a weapon that never depends on seeker heads or data links. In training, pilots practice the choreography of radar modes, missile cues, and gun solutions until it becomes second nature. The flow from detection to decision to weapon release has to be smooth. Around all of this technology is the human space that makes the machine livable. The cockpit is cramped but laid out so that checklists, knee boards, and oxygen lines all have their place, and the environmental control system works to keep temperatures tolerable from high-altitude cold to desert heat. On the ground, Maintainers use built-in walkways along the fuselage and wing routes to reach inspection panels without damaging the skin. Turning an Eagle around from recovery to a new launch means refueling, loading weapons, checking engines and systems, and running quick debriefs with the pilot, all under the jet's broad wings. When the aircraft taxis out again, everyone involved shares the same assumption that guided its design from the start. Once it is in the air, friendly forces should own that piece of sky. The human world built around the Eagle, from cockpit ergonomics to maintenance walkways, only mattered because of what the jet did when it left the ground. That performance under fire would write the reputation that pilots and planners carried into later wars. By the time those Eagles slipped across the Iraqi border in 1991, the aircraft already carried a history written in someone else's logbooks. The F-15 first proved itself in the hands of Israeli pilots in the late 1970s and early 1980s, meeting Syrian fighters over Lebanon in a series of sharp, unforgiving engagements. In those battles, the mix of powerful radar, long-range missiles, and tight turning performance meant the Eagle often started each fight with a clear advantage. Many engagements ended before the opposing pilots ever got a clear visual of the aircraft that killed them. That long string of kills without corresponding losses convinced planners that the Eagle concept worked in real air combat, not just on test ranges. Operation Desert Storm brought the largest test yet, with American and Allied F-15s tasked to tear down Iraqi air defenses and protect strike aircraft over long distances. The Eagles from that opening night vignette were part of a layered shield, guided by controllers in airborne warning and control aircraft who could see the broader air picture. When Iraqi fighters lifted to challenge coalition raids, the F-15s moved in to intercept, using radar to search and track beyond visual range, which describes engagements at distances where pilots still cannot see the other aircraft with their eyes. Missiles were often fired at long range, with pilots trusting radar data and guidance logic instead of the classic dogfight view over the canopy rail. It was a new style of air combat built on information and reach. Not every engagement was that clean or that distant. Iraqi pilots sometimes tried to use low-level flight and ground clutter to hide from radar, ducking along the deck to make themselves harder to pick out. At other times, they turned back toward their own surface-to-air missile belts, hoping pursuing Eagles would hesitate to follow. In those more complex fights, the F-15's agility and thrust kept options open. Pilots could crank the jet into hard turns, climb rapidly out of missile envelopes, or reposition for clearer shots while still keeping enough energy to escape if the situation turned bad. That flexibility kept crews alive. On some missions, the mere presence of Eagle patrols persuaded Iraqi pilots to land or flee rather than offer battle. That effect, driving opponents out of the sky before missiles even left the rails, preserved the machine's most precious contribution. Air forces on the coalition side could plan strikes without assuming constant fighter opposition all along the route. The end result was a campaign in which the F-15's design purpose came fully into focus. It did not win Desert Storm alone, but it created bubbles of airspace where bombers, attack aircraft, and surveillance platforms could work with far less fear. The opening night scene, with unseen MiGs falling in distant fire, was not an isolated flash of drama. It was a typical expression of what the Eagle had been built to do from the start. The aircraft changed the balance of risk in the sky so decisively that planners could shift their main attention to targets on the ground. That is the measure of an air superiority fighter. When it does its job, the rest of the force has room to breathe. When pilots and maintainers talk about what made the F-15 special, the first answers usually involve power and awareness. The aircraft's thrust-to-weight ratio, the relationship between engine power and airframe mass, allowed it to climb steeply, accelerate hard, and recover energy in a turning fight more quickly than many contemporaries. The large radar and head-up display gave pilots a strong, coherent picture of the air battle, especially when paired with skilled controllers in support aircraft feeding them information. Crews also valued the simple fact that the jet could haul a serious missile load into combat, often with fuel to spare, which let them stay on station through the long stretches of quiet between brief moments of violence. That endurance built confidence. From the ground crew perspective, strength showed up in structural toughness and systems designed with combat durability in mind. The landing gear tolerated rough landings at heavy weights, and built-in test equipment helped maintainers quickly isolate faults instead of chasing intermittent problems in the dark. Over time, improvements to engines and avionics cut down on some of the early headaches, increasing sortie rates and making it easier to keep squadrons fully mission-capable. Commanders liked having a fighter that, when properly supported, could answer a wide range of air defense needs with the same basic airframe. One jet type could cover many missions. Weaknesses were present as well, and they shaped how the Eagle was used. The aircraft was large and relatively expensive, demanding significant fuel and tanker support for long missions. Its sophisticated radar and avionics required careful maintenance, and operating costs per flight hour were high compared to lighter fighters. In tight budget environments, that translated into fewer airframes and a constant tension between flying enough hours for pilot proficiency and preserving service life. Choices about where to base F-15s and how often to deploy them were never simple. Adversaries who studied the Eagle learned to respect it, but also looked for ways to blunt its advantages. Flying at very low altitude, using terrain and clutter to mask their approach, or relying on surprise from unexpected directions could complicate an F-15's long-range radar picture. Some potential enemies invested heavily in surface-to-air missile networks and integrated air defenses, reasoning that the surest way to deal with the Eagle was not to fight it directly in the air at all. Compared with smaller fighters, such as the F-16, the F-15 sacrificed some simplicity and low cost in exchange for sheer reach and sensor power. That trade made sense in its intended role, but it also locked the aircraft into a particular niche as a high-end, high-demand asset. The earliest F-15A and two-seat F-15B models provided the foundation, but they were only the starting point for a long family tree. As experience accumulated, the F-15C and D variants arrived with improved radar, more internal fuel, and strengthened airframes that could carry new generations of missiles and extra tanks. These upgraded Eagles became the main air superiority workhorses through the 1980s and into the post-Cold War era, standing alert in Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Small refinements in electronics and cockpit displays made it easier for pilots to sort targets and survive in increasingly complex electronic environments. Evolution was steady. The biggest change in the family was the emergence of the F-15E Strike Eagle, a two-seat strike fighter that took the basic airframe and turned it into a long-range precision attack platform while preserving strong air-to-air ability. With conformal fuel tanks hugging the sides of the fuselage, modern navigation and attack systems, and the ability to carry guided bombs under its wings, the Strike Eagle gave planners a way to hit heavily defended targets deep inside enemy territory. At the same time, it retained the performance and survivability that had made the original F-15 attractive. In practice, Strike Eagles often flew missions that combined self-escort with precision strikes, making them some of the most heavily tasked aircraft in later conflicts. Export variants carried the concept even further. Partner nations in the Middle East and Asia accepted Eagles tailored to their own doctrine and budgets, many with unique avionics fits or local weapons integrations. Over time, new build versions incorporated advanced radars, updated cockpits, and modern defensive suites, ensuring that even as stealth fighters arrived, the latest Eagles remained credible frontline aircraft. The ongoing evolution into advanced models kept the basic idea alive. It stayed a fast, long-legged fighter that brought a powerful radar and significant firepower to the opening stages of any air campaign. The F-15's legacy begins with its combat record, but extends deep into doctrine and design thinking. For decades, air forces looked at the Eagle's combination of power, sensors, and weapons and saw proof that a dedicated air superiority fighter could change the shape of a conflict by dominating the early days of a campaign. That experience influenced the design and justification of later stealth fighters that promised to carry the same air dominance mission into more dangerous air defense environments. Training syllabi, tactics manuals, and large force exercises all absorbed lessons learned in Eagles, from the importance of energy management and maneuvers to the value of tightly integrating fighters with airborne controllers and support aircraft. Those lessons spread widely. Physically, the aircraft itself is now a museum piece in some locations, even as other examples continue to fly. Visitors to major aviation museums in the United States can walk under retired Eagles preserved indoors, often displayed with missiles and tanks that hint at their wartime loads. Outdoor displays at air bases and memorial parks put F-15s on pedestals or gate guard mounts, their gray paint and swept lines greeting generations of airmen and visitors. Many of these airframes served through the Cold War into the new century, carrying serial numbers that link them to specific squadrons and deployments. Each jet carries its own quiet story. For those who want a deeper connection, photo and video collections from exercises and operations capture Eagles at full power. They show aircraft banking hard against blue skies, spraying vapor from their wings, or sitting on alert pads with weapons crews at work. Within the broader dispatch and trackpads ecosystem, the F-15 appears in companion features such as oral history interviews with pilots and maintainers, and stories that place the jet alongside other aircraft in shared campaigns. A listener who begins with this Arsenal episode can follow those trails to see how the Eagle's story overlaps with ground battles, coalition partnerships, and the long evolution of air power thinking. The web of connections is dense. Behind the numbers and the sharp angles, the legacy that matters most remains human. For pilots, maintainers, and sometimes opponents, the F-15 was the machine that defined what the sky felt like in their era, a standard by which other aircraft were judged, and a presence that shaped life and death choices in combat. You can find narrated versions of other Arsenal features as part of the Trackpads podcast feeds and Dispatch audio editions. In every case, the hardware is a frame for the people whose lives turned on how well it performed when the stakes were highest.